Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Very nice to welcome you all and to welcome Dr. Vindhya Buthpitiya, who is an anthropologist and a lecturer in the Department of Social Anthropology at St Andrews University. Her research addresses conflict and visual culture with a focus on ethno-nationalism and political violence in relation to Sri Lanka and concerning the local and the global ramifications of the Civil War, looking at practices of making, sharing, circulating, and presumably suppressing or contesting images. And the title of Vindhya's lecture this evening is Studio Ilankai, a Tamil photographic history of Sri Lankan citizenship. Vindhya, thanks so much for joining us as part of the By4 Collective and our lectures on photography and democracy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, Tom, Helen, for the really kind invitation and for organizing the series of lectures, and to everyone who made time to join us on a Friday afternoon, evening. It's really appreciated. I'm going to, in the interest of time, get started. So my interest in an inquiry of photography in Sri Lanka has largely been focused on its political work, seemingly mundane photographs, and their extraordinarily diverse social and political permutations and reworkings that emerged out of a context characterized by protracted ethno-nationalist conflict, pervasive state violence and terror, and multiple anti-state insurgencies. The photography studio has in many ways been at the heart of this undertaking. It's also essential to recognize the political and other work of photographers, known and unknown, for the unnoticed, tireless, and often thankless labor of recording daily life and death amid war and amid crisis and after crisis, in recognition of the precarity of history in the face of systematic and violent erasure, and how their business is integral to securing their sitters' aspirations for better lives. There are three considerations to keep in mind before we proceed. Firstly, the scholarship on Sri Lanka's photographic history is sparse, favoring the work of colonial or elite practitioners based in the island's capital of Colombo. Here, studio photography is cast as largely uninteresting and unremarkable, and its practitioners are rarely remembered in high esteem. Early Tamil studio photographers in northern Sri Lanka, who have made outstanding contributions to technical developments in photography in particular, continue to be sidelined in Sri Lanka's partial historiography. Secondly, Sri Lanka was ethnogeographically cleaved through 3 decades of civil war from 1983 to 2009, fought between the government of Sri Lanka and the Tamil militancy, who sought to establish a sovereign Tamil homeland. During this period, studios served as important arbiters between states, militaries, and the general public in a fraught political institutional milieu of negotiating citizenship and managing potentially fatal risk. This was bound to the expansion of identity photography and surveillance, entangled with intensifying securitization and militarization, which significantly impacted everyday safety and movement, especially for Tamils. The armed conflict and its troubled aftermath were felt and expressed deeply in local studio photography in the north and east of Sri Lanka. Studios were afforded particular importance by state actors, and their spaces, techniques, and photographs were actively integrated into the operations and ambitions of competing nation-state projects and their citizen-making endeavors. Contemporary workings of photography studios and their diverse photographic repertoires span from identity, passport, and visa photography to matchmaking portraiture and birthday party, puberty ceremony, and engagement and wedding photography. The expanding biometric registration of persons and acquiring identity cards, passports, and visas have sustained the need for photography studios in an age of widely accessible mobile phones and digital cameras. So studios then intervene between states and citizens and migrants and borders, where desires for mobility are commonplace, by providing a range of technologies of legibility wielded by the specific skills and wisdoms of photographers. In doing so, studio photographers assist their clients in realizing their dreams and fantasies, whether in creating cinematic portraits for newlyweds and newborns, or capturing lucky visa photographs that will ensure a prospective migrant success. Studio photographers are also caretakers, the preservers of images, documenters of community memories, and the meticulous preparers of memorial portraits to honor the dead. While they're rarely praised for their skill or their artistic merit, or seldom remembered for their talents as photographers, the pictures make up most of the lively Tamil image worlds of North and East Sri Lanka. Many undertake this responsibility with a deep sense of care and duty, recognizing that their skill in producing even banal images have the power to transform lives and sustain remembering. Though they might be ignored by photographic history, these mitigations position studio photographers as key figures within their communities, summoning duty, fate, and fortune through photography, but importantly, as essential and often subversive intermediaries in citizen making and border work, as I will discuss in more detail. The studio, while engaged in the vibrant picturing of communities, has been firmly and formally anchored to the state through its integration into the Citizen Registration Project, which required front-facing portraits of individuals to be produced for use in passports and national identity cards or NICs. We might extend these parameters of the concept of citizenship to mechanisms of bordering, where territoriality is foundational to state formation. Through this framing, photography studios in Sri Lanka's north and east function as sites of overlaid internal and external bordering, but also operate in the midst of failed bordering, where demand for secession or the establishing of a border, which took the shape of the Tamil nation state, was brutally suppressed by military victory by the Sri Lankan armed forces that decimated the Tamil militancy fighting for an independent Tamil homeland. Indeed, it is this failed bordering that magnifies disillusionment and impairments to Tamil citizenship and demands for sovereignty in ways that further propel outmigration in what exists as a transnationally dispersed and borderless in more than one sense nation. Then, Tamil photography studios exist at the intersection of these tensions of bordering and impaired and desired citizenship. Today, the studio is directly tethered via the quote-unquote online as it's described and sold, or more specifically, Photo Studio Solution or Photo Studio Client software, connected to the internet as an extension of government citizen registration mechanisms for national identity cards and passports. The NIC is essential for obtaining adult citizens' passports, so I consider them as linked processes. This results in rendering individuals legible to both national and international state actors, adapting James Scott's term, whether they are clerks engaged in processing passport documents, immigration officials at the Sri Lankan border, visa officers at local embassies, or border officials and guards beyond. The studio, in this scenario, is then a node containing a range of technologies of legibility, geared towards form filling, scanning, printing, photocopying, police report filing, emailing, and even facilitating medical examinations required for foreign employment as well as migration, along with other incidentals such as phone charging, layering connectivities upon connectivities between state and an as yet illegible citizen. The online studio, as a technology unto itself, makes individuals readable as citizens in biometric and other terms to the state machinery. Through these machinations, studio photographers also seek to validate their expertise and authority in giving photographic shape to regulations and government specifications. They effectively navigate the technologies through exacting compliance, which may appear as conformity, but in ways that are often expressly disobedient and subversive, in recognition of the fact that the state does not, in fact, support its individual or collective Tamil mobility or aspirations. It is about making Tamils legible to Sri Lanka or becoming Sri Lanka approved, as one advert notes, and notably as a practical necessity and alleviation in response to a state that many rarely claim, and indeed a state that barely claims them. A backdrop of ethno-nationalist conflict, war, and post-war, and recent financial crisis also demand that we extend the framing of citizenship to include aspirations and desires for citizenship beyond the island, where Sri Lankan citizenship is ethnicized, unequal, and largely diminished for the island's political minorities, which have looked elsewhere for the possibility of parity and mobility. We begin to grasp this through a series of studio produced, ubiquitous photographic objects and practices related to citizen making and border work. The National Identity Card or NIC, passports and visa, as well as the diverse remediations of these officially demanded images. So, where citizenship and indeed nation state are contested, as in the case of Sri Lanka, how might we understand how Tamils have existed within and navigated Sri Lankan citizenship, which many of my interlocutors describe as second class, or sought out other citizenships through the frame of the photography studio? How might studio photography then help us understand or expand our understanding of how Sri Lankan citizenship is not only pictured but lived, negotiated, altered, and embraced or rejected? In the interest of time, this is a condensed extract from a much more substantial piece of work, Studio Ilankai, a book in progress, which examines the vibrant daily workings of photography studios and Tamil-speaking communities in Sri Lanka. I hope to set out the significance of photography studios to identity formation, nation, belonging, and citizen making, foregrounding how and why studios persist as vital spaces for preserving local and national histories as intermediaries between state and citizens, giving visual form to individual and collective aspirations, dreams, and fantasies, and improvising and safeguarding through times of political violence and upheaval. I loosely draw on ethnographic research carried out in Jaffna, Kilinochchi, Trincomalee, and Colombo from 2016 to present. Some essential context first, which frames the difficult and often tense relationship between the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil citizens of Sri Lanka, and the enduring sense of disillusionment that continues. The country's experience with conflict and upheaval have been seemingly relentless since the mid-20th century. The status quo of normalized violence has compounded principally freedoms, spaces, and capacities for political participation and expression, and importantly, ethnicized ordering and implicit bordering of citizenship, positioning the majority Sinhalese community from the south of Sri Lanka as the rightful custodians of the island, and other ethno-religious minorities, especially those from the northeast and hill country, as interlopers. This is significant precisely because of the ways in which Sri Lankan citizenship and in turn identity documents have been constructed through a colonially instituted legislative framework that continues to classify and indeed hierarchize types of belonging. My engagement with photography studios began in relation to the Sri Lankan Civil War, fought between the Tamil militancy, dominated by the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam, and the Sri Lankan government. The war began in the early 1980s and ended in 2009, following a military victory by the state forces riddled with mass atrocities committed by the state forces against the northern Tamil community, coupled with credible allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity, which, from a transitional justice perspective, remain unresolved. Decades of mass violence exacerbated Tamil experiences of unequal citizenship vis-à-vis the Sri Lankan state. The post-war milieu has been configured as one of peace by military victory, positioning Tamils and other political minorities in a place of precarity and marginalization, where Sinhala nationalist majoritarianism as state policy persists as a status quo and endorsement of continuing spectacular and structural violence against its opponents and critics. This long durée of ethno-nationalist struggle, armed conflict, compromised Tamil citizenship, and post-war violence, notably the continuing torture of young Tamils at the hands of the Sri Lankan security apparatus for involvement in political activity, has been entangled then with mass migration and forced displacement and dispersal. Grievances and anxieties pertaining to citizenship and mobility, long defined by the causes and effects of ethno-nationalist conflict and civil war, have been further magnified following the recent economic crisis of 2022. The resultant shortage of passports, for instance, was still felt in 2025, when overseas job applicants, typically young Tamil men, continue to arrive in photography studios seeking guidance from photographers who may have insight into where or when they might be able to secure a passport appointment or request help with official form filling. The photographers always kindly obliged, even though all that was required of them technically is a deft snap of the camera to be dispatched into the government portal. We do what we can to help, a photographer in Trincomalee says, after advising two young men who arrive in the studio in the morning with various forms and files. They were hoping for employment in the Middle East and obtaining a passport would get them a step closer to this. They're young boys and they're desperate to make something of their lives and make a good life for themselves. There are no chances for young people here. Everyone is looking to leave, he said with resignation. Even prior to the war, the Tamil community has had a long history of economic migration throughout the 20th century. However, the 1983 Black July anti-Tamil pogrom marked one of the first major waves of Tamil migration to Europe, North America, Australia, intensifying over the 3 decades that followed, resulting in the formation of an influential diaspora. This continued after the end of the war as a result of perceived lack of opportunity as well as persecution by state security forces, especially of those with past links to the Tamil militancy. Those seeking to leave chose to pursue both lawful and unlawful means as a way to remedy unequal Sri Lankan citizenship. It is estimated that about a quarter of the Tamil population live outside Sri Lanka, predominantly as a consequence of war. The war years and the instability and exacerbated inequalities of the post war magnified the life or death desperations, desires, and aspirations for new kinds of citizenship, which relied on various migration strategies, including asylum claims, family reunion, and marriage. These have importantly relied on studio based photographic production and how they advance legibility, and certainly how photographers position themselves as vital intermediaries in realizing aspirations for citizenship. For instance, photographers will spend many days preparing wedding albums, which will satisfy even the most disbelieving and onerous first world immigration officer, with attention to evidencing through photography kinship, affection between the couple, wedding traditions which ground the union in religion and ritual, among others. In these albums, couples are transported via Photoshop into their dreams for the future, whether that is to embrace in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower or the Taj Mahal, worship at the temples of Tanjore, or own a luxury car and mansion. Some photographers even include the marriage certificate in the album as a safety measure where documents are easily lost. For many, transnational marriages make possible new citizenships that afford more stable or secure futures elsewhere. Heavily stylized wedding photography proved no less indexical to confirming the authenticity of a marital relationship, even though these images were manipulated to extraordinary effect. This, to visa officers, signaled its rootedness in Tamil culture, thus proving the legitimacy of the marriage, even though these occupied a completely different register and aesthetic of evidence compared with official photographs used for the purpose of citizen identification and registration. If identity documents confirming citizenship were a means of navigating precarity while physically moving through the post war landscape in Sri Lanka, these supplemented a means of escape through aspirational citizenship. Even if their work is often dismissed as unremarkable or mundane, photographers recognize how their skills are integral to their clients becoming successfully legible within state mechanisms. This was, for several studio photographer interlocutors, a matter of pride, ascertain not only in the ways in which they have swiftly and capably embraced these new technologies, but in avoiding rejections that not only jeopardize their clients' chance of success, but potentially their own business. Where photographs for aspiring migrants are concerned, photographers consistently reference the auspiciousness associated with their practice, specifically the idea of kairasi, or the idea of the lucky or auspicious or even fated hand, which attracts customers, particularly those looking for success in visa applications. This is also then an intertwining of fates, signaling the importance of duty and conviction in the work of photographers and their commitment to their communities. It is skill and reputation for auspiciousness that is inherently bound up with what is ultimately incontrovertible compliance with the state's specification, but also engaging in then the state's border work as a node within a system of entangled technologies that afford this legibility. However, by casting this in a language of fate and devotion that elude the precision and demands of state, bureaucracy, and digital technology, what is revealed is how skillful compliance can also mean trickery or sleight of hand that allows for disobedience to pull one over the seemingly all powerful states that suppress freedoms and view potential migrants with suspicion. Then, within this context, Sri Lanka is not a citizenship indicating a kind of belonging or necessarily even a national identity. Many northern Tamils treat its necessity as practicality, allowing everyday navigations to access basic services, confirmation of identity, or indeed as documentation that is prerequisite for migration and seeking citizenship elsewhere. The Sri Lankan state's association with photography studios had long been consolidated through its identity documents. In 1972, which had the state, which had shed its dominion status and the name Ceylon, renamed itself as Sri Lanka. And it initiated a photographic documentation project as a part of this with the support of East Germany, which donated a few thousand Praktica cameras that were distributed to photography studios, including in the north and east of Sri Lanka, charged with producing identity portraits. The National Identity Card, or NIC, became essential proof and of identity and ethnicity during multiple periods of conflict. Studios became further absorbed into the war efforts in new ways during this time, with both the military and the LTTE engaging with studios to demand the production of images for military IDs and records, as well as documenting events including parades and funerals. If NICs issued in Sinhalese and Tamil language were a matter of internal legibility pertaining to ethno-linguistic, geographic, and tacit name-derived ethnic and caste markers of one's official personhood as an adult citizen, the passport then represents a kind of external legibility that demarcated citizenship more explicitly for an outside state and authority. However, this is not as straightforward within the context of a state's investment in controlling out migration in relation to not just labor related economic reasons, but also perceived security threats associated with the frequently demonized Tamil diaspora as an enabler and financial supporter of militancy and anti state sentiment and activity. An NIC required by those applying for a passport, but uh, passports, particularly all country passports, have not always been guaranteed to all applicants due to the aforementioned concerns of the state and decades of conflict induced migration, where mobility, understood as visa free travel, associated with the Sri Lankan passport, remains among the worst in the world, pointing to the internal border management undertaken by the Sri Lankan state, which has been consistently defined in terms of who was permitted to leave from the inside rather than necessarily facilitating international travel beyond the island. Founded in 19th and early 20th century legislation established by the British colonial administration that centered the control of labor movement, whether from India to Ceylon or Ceylon to elsewhere, and preventing those regarded as, quote, destitute, vicious persons and stowaways, or, quote, Indians deemed as belonging to criminal tribes, end quote, from arriving in Ceylon. This language has underpinned the ostracism and hostilities directed at the Indian origin Tamil community in particular as non-citizens by Sinhalese and Sri Lankan Tamils as they are officially differentiated in the census. This control related to labor persisted in issuing passports and certainly informed imaginaries of what movement was possible by way of passports, not only for Tamils but for Sri Lankans more broadly, following market liberalization in the late 1970s. The demand for labor in the Middle East provided to be a beneficial solution to the Sri Lankan government, which advertised itself internationally as having the cheapest labor in South Asia. Migrant worker remittances became one of the principal sources of income for the island, covering approximately 80% of the annual trade deficit on average over the past 2 decades. Additionally, The practice of issuing select country passports, which was in place until 2018, was aimed at those seeking employment abroad as migrant laborers in the Arab Gulf or traveling to India for pilgrimage for small scale business. Once notorious for its corruption, Colombo's Central Passport Office epitomized opacity as the outcome of a passport could not be guaranteed, especially for those who were socially or economically marginalized. External fixers and brokers are ever present, even with the digitalization of the passport and NIC process, offering those who arrive at its premises in Colombo swift passage through the long waits and bureaucratic hurdles. However, with the integration of studios through online photo studio services into this bureaucracy of citizen registration, studio owners, photographers, and assistants have emerged as new essential middlemen and arbiters of a series of technologies permitting direct access to the state through a virtual portal located in the photography studio. The passport office in the capital Colombo exists in relation to a ring of satellite like studios circling the premises, assembling services, technologies, and managing the flow of people into the central office building. And indeed, this extends to every government authorized studio in the island, forming a network of nodes, photographic infrastructure, and labor, all linked back to a central building in Colombo. This history permits us to think through the photography studio and its relationship to citizenship and borders as a site of internal and external bordering as materialized through photography, but specifically the technology of photography and its expanded capacities integrated with the biometric, but also the particular significance of bordering as political aspiration for the Tamil community in the north and east of Sri Lanka, and how the photography studio then sits at the crossroads of these intersecting borders and failed and aspirant citizenships. The 2022 financial crisis also precipitated a new set of problems and heightened inequalities. In January 2023, in the strained aftermath of Sri Lanka's 2022 economic crisis, I asked Mr. K, a Jaffna-based studio photographer I had known for many years and was never shy about complaining, how he was faring. Unexpectedly, he announced gleefully that business had in fact been thriving. In April 2022, Sri Lanka tumbled into unprecedented economic difficulty and public unrest. Catastrophic mismanagement by the government, combined with the economic impacts of the pandemic, caused the country's currency reserves to dwindle dangerously. With crushing debt, inflation, import restrictions, food, fuel, and essential goods and medication shortages, coupled with daily power cuts, Sri Lankans were burdened with an untenable cost of living. An angry public took to the streets as the country announced a default on its external debt payments and looked to the IMF for a bailout. Northern Tamils pointedly did not participate in these protests, just as their transitional justice oriented protests and grievances, especially as it related to the families of the disappeared, had remained largely ignored by those in the South for well over a decade. What would become known as the Janata Aragalaya, or the People's Struggle, a mass movement, led to the ousting of the president, prime minister, and assorted members of of the Rajapaksa family from office. To the Tamil community, importantly, the President Prime Minister Rajapaksa brothers were also the architects of the end of the war and mass atrocities committed against Tamils and the total annihilation of the Tamil militancy, and with its possibility of a Tamil nation state, or more bluntly, the possibility to establish a border that confirms sovereignty and citizenship. Outmigration from the island escalated like never before. Sri Lanka saw 311,269 people leaving the country in 2022 alone, purportedly the highest numbers in recent history. Indeed, the queues at Colombo's passport office, the only location in the island where one was able to obtain one-day service, became unmanageable, with thousands of people flocking to the building. Filtered and channeled by way of photography studios around the country with the intention of obtaining a passport. The country would also run out of both paper and passports during this time. Mr. K tells me that over the past 2 months alone, so this is the last 2 months of 2022, the studio had processed 1,000 passport photographs for aspiring migrants. No mean feat for a peripheral studio located in a small town in the north of the Jaffna Peninsula. Visa photograph demands had also skyrocketed, with small immigration businesses mushrooming across the peninsula as towns, providing application assistance to choice European and North American destinations. There was also a noticeable boom in European language class offerings, with small tutories promoting French, German, Italian, and English lessons. In the studios I had frequented for years prior to the crisis, signage and advertisements relating to NIC, passport, and visa photography took much greater prominence, with virtually everyone having invested in new promotional material offline and online. Even studios that had previously chosen not to integrate into the government system due to the tedious paperwork and investment required, because identity photography was considered not substantial enough an income, had changed their minds to become government authorized studios. Photographers were offering their services more visibly than ever before to intervene in matters of citizenship and border crossing. One of the older studios in Jaffna Town, which had been particularly reluctant about providing digitalized registration services post crisis, even had a new facelift and display installed at a time where such work was inordinately expensive. Prior to the crisis, it felt like it was on its last legs, and indeed, COVID had not helped. But suddenly, the studio had gained new and vibrant life, facilitated by demands for outmigration. The studio's registration with the Department of Immigration and Immigration and the Department for the Registration of Persons was one which demanded a considerable commitment, financial and otherwise. In many ways, the state requirement to produce identity photography sustained studios, even though they are probably the least lucrative form of photographic production. However, this participation by studios is one that necessitates investing in the cost of registration, renewal fees, equipment, and facilities to meet required technical specifications that permit, in the language of the Department of Immigration and Immigration, to abide by their policy in issuing high quality passports to the nation. Photographers are trained and provided with necessary software according to criteria set out by the department, and the studios are required to have a range of necessary facilities, including a dressing room, mirrors, as well as adequate space for a camera to subject distance and be located close to public transportation, revealing the spatial and infrastructural dimensions of the studio's border work and citizen making practices. In addition to this, images produced by the photography studio must also be compliant in line with biometric and a list of expectations, including showing the applicant's eyes clearly without spectacles, those who request to wear caps and scarves having their forehead and ears clearly visible, and to be unaffected by shadows. What is even more striking is the punitive measures put in place for studios who fail to meet these checks. And these are described as offenses, and the studio is liable to being investigated and could lead to potential removal or blacklisting. While the prices of basics were eye-wateringly high, the goods shortages so stark in the South were somehow less visible in Jaffna. When I pressed him on the effects of the crisis, Mr. K responded blithely, "Everything is expensive, but Jaffna people have money." Jaffna's relationship to Sri Lanka's economy had been long vexed following the harsh decade-long embargo imposed by the government from 1990 to the early 2000s. The community's weathering of this period and was repeatedly and critically invoked during the 2022 crisis, especially because many in the South did not seem to be aware that such a thing had even happened. Similarly, this time was also remembered as a testament to the ingenuity, improvisation, and resourcefulness of the community, but also a sense of national self sufficiency in the face of the Sri Lankan government's incapacity and cruelty. For studio photographers who had persisted through the embargo in the 1990s, it was a time of heightened production, much like the period of the 2022 crisis, that points to a compelling disjunction between these integrated but ultimately parallel economies and extant and de facto citizenries. At present, it's rare to find anyone in Sri Lanka's north and east who did not have immediate family members or close relatives overseas, often sometimes those who send money, though not through the banking system, to the ire of the Sri Lankan government, whose reserves had been crushed by the depletion of migrant remittances caused by the pandemic. But the informal transfers, blamed often as a racket, run by backroom international money transfer operations that organized unofficial capital hops to borrow from James Ferguson between the north and east of Sri Lanka and major European and American cities, made possible by a network of migrants. Government crackdown on these businesses also worsened during this time. However, desires to leave and become citizens elsewhere in the wake of a failed nation-state building project had only escalated, especially for those who weren't as well integrated into the transnationally dispersed Tamil community, with those actively seeking opportunities elsewhere amid countrywide desperation where chances of recovery seemed impossible and compounded immensely existing inequalities. So while there was an appearance of prosperity, it also meant that those who were already economically marginalized within the North and East were looking to any means possible to get out. The confirmation of citizenship, in other words, became necessary to potentially access citizenship elsewhere. Indeed, there were also demographics who were actively choosing to take boats, for instance, whatever the outcome, even if death. The passport then also becomes something that is accessible to Tamils with means, further hierarchizing citizenship along social class and income as much as ethnicity, however politically marginalized one's ethnicity might be. Indeed, direct discouragement to exit had become firmly embedded sorry, indeed, direct encouragement to exit had become firmly embedded in the landscape, with hoardings inviting local to leave with promises of guaranteed success for exclusive millionaire opportunities. Within such a context, then, the studio, historically and certainly colonially established, within such a context, then, the studios, historically and certainly colonially established multi layered citizen making and border work had become amplified, with even the government actively encouraging state employees to seek jobs abroad for which it would grant a 5 year leave of absence. This returns us to the point about post-colonial citizenship and passports and their associations with labor, but also specifically a matter of who can leave the island rather than simply allowing a holder of a passport or an identity document to cross international borders. What also becomes visible here is the work of the studio in facilitating this process. Everyday studio photography allows us these unexpected and rich insights into the dynamic and complex negotiations of impaired and aspirational citizenship in ways that the bureaucracies and documents alone cannot. And indeed, these enrich our understanding of the work of photographers within their communities as wielders of much more than the camera, but intermediaries of also of fate and fortune. Thank you.
Brilliant, Vindhya. Thank you so much on behalf of our audience. That was really fascinating insight into the complex relationships in Sri Lanka in the sort of post-colonial, post-war context. Those relationships between citizenship and photography. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, we'll stop the recording and open up for Q&A.